Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video for History Guy Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Joseph A.P. Wilson. This is his second appearance on the channel, and today we're going to be discussing his article, Paul and Women's Speech. He is currently lecturer at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Fairfield University, and also instructor at Department of Philosophy, Theology, and Religious Studies at Sacred Heart University. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Okay, so I'm here to talk about a recent publication in the journal Religions, where a special issue on race and family and gender in early Christianity. And my contribution advances a position in a long-running debate about the historical Paul and his character and his message and the community that he founded, and what was that community in terms of its gender dynamics and social aspects. Your viewers may be aware. You can put up the first slide from the slideshow now if you want. Just open it. So yeah, the actual full title of the article is "Recasting Paul as a Chauvinist Within the Western Text Type Manuscript Tradition," and it's an open access article. We can provide the link. All right, you can advance one more slide.
All right.
Folks may be aware of this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. It's one of the most difficult passages in the New Testament with regard to controversies surrounding women's public leadership prerogatives. The passage, of course, that's quoted by usually people who are denying women the right to speak or lead in Christianity. They say women should keep silent in churches. They're not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, even as the law says. So the law is key here. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Okay, so this passage fits within a larger context of what Paul writes about women. And so there are other tricky passages too. This is not the only difficult passage in the entire Pauline corpus, but it is undoubtedly the most difficult passage because for a number of reasons. So the reason why this is such a difficult passage is there is a lot of evidence that the historical Paul did not think like this. And yet this passage is in all the earliest manuscripts. So there's no evidence of any manuscripts lacking this passage. There is an argument for an interpolation that this is not original to the epistle, but as I will demonstrate, I think that argument is incorrect. But I also believe, with a lot of critical scholars, that the historical Paul was a gender egalitarian. He was not the misogynist, not the person who denied women's speaking authority that he is commonly represented as in traditionalist circles. So the traditionalist view of Paul as denying women's leadership goes back to before the Council of Nicaea, as we see the emerging hierarchy as the church starts to form into its bureaucratic institution. The denial of women's leadership becomes important, and so Paul is used to justify that institutional development. And so that's when the interpretation of these passages, the normal interpretation of these passages emerges from that time, like the 3rd century. Early 3rd century is when you see this sort of conventional wisdom about this passage. But why is it that people say that there's something wrong here? Because the same epistle, the first epistle to the Corinthians, which is one of the earliest and most popular Christian documents by far, says elsewhere that women are allowed to speak in church, right? And I don't want to quote verses and chapters because off the top of my head, because I might make a mistake, but suffice it to say, earlier in the epistle, when they're talking about women prophesying with their head covered, that's in the context of the liturgical assembly. So you can't have women prophesying with covered heads in the church and not speaking, right? So, so the fact is that over and over again throughout the genuine epistles of Paul, women's ability to speak in church is somewhat taken for granted, and except for in this passage. All right, so let's go one more slide onward. So I am a proponent of what's commonly referred to as the quotation-refutation hypothesis for explaining this passage. So Paul is not somebody who is writing in a vacuum here. He's not just composing this letter from scratch. The first letter to the Corinthians is actually a response to a letter from the Corinthians to Paul. It's a lost letter. We don't know exactly what the letter contained, but it was, and Paul's letter to the Corinthians is addressing controversies and difficulties raised by the letter from the Corinthians to Paul. The congregation in Corinth is a Gentile-dominated congregation with a few Jewish Christian elites. So it's, there are, not to say there aren't Jews there, but the Jewish leaders of the Jesus movement are not the majority of that group. And so they've written a bunch of, things about the problems that they're facing in the congregation. Paul is correcting them and giving them advice. So the quotation-refutation hypothesis suggests that this passage, 34 through 35. 33 is actually technically part of the earlier. The 33b is sometimes used to introduce the passage in modern interpretation, but it's actually more a conclusion to the previous passage. So the 34 and 35 are actually a quotation of the lost Corinthian letter to Paul, and Paul's response is indignant and is a twofold negative rhetorical query where he's actually admonishing the male speaker of the previous passage that the male speaker of the previous passage, or the writer of the previous passage, is incorrect. What? Did the word of God originate with you? Or are you the only ones it has reached? And the key to this interpretation, and by the way, this quotation-refutation hypothesis has been proposed independently by English-speaking and critical scholars, by at least 4 of them in the last 150 years or so. So over the last 150 years, about 4 different scholars, independently using just the grammar and the structure of this passage, proposed a quotation-refutation hypothesis here. And the basis for that is both the translating the eta, which is the beginning of verse 36, as an epithet expressing disagreement, like a negative particle, and then the fact that the word only ones, which is munos in Greek, that this word is the masculine version of that pronoun, indicating that the person being criticized there is male, or a group that includes males. That can be a gender neutral construction, which is how it's conventionally read, is like a gender neutral reference to the congregation. But if the passage was referring to women exclusively, they could have chosen a feminine pronoun in that position, and the author didn't. Paul did not, which indicates that there is tension between these 2 passages. Okay, you can go to the next slide. People who regard this as an interpolation, which is the other view of egalitarian Paulists. So reminder, traditionalist Paulists think that Paul really thought this. The critical scholars who regard Paul as a gender egalitarian, somebody who believed that women should be leaders on the basis of a lot of other evidence to that effect. These folks regard it as a quotation like I do, or as an interpolation, the way that, some scholars Bart Ehrman, I think, is on the interpolation side, as a number of other important scholars are. And the basis for that is that it's unstable. That passage is not always in the same place in the manuscript. There are some manuscripts where it is moved to the end of the chapter following verse 40. And then there's another basis for the interpolation argument is the lack of Paul's use of the word permit, permitted, permit. That Greek word never appears in any of the other epistles attributed to Paul except for one, which is the first letter to Timothy, which is almost universally regarded as a forgery by critical scholars. So critical scholars regard 1 Timothy as fake Paul or pseudo Paul. He's called the pastor. And there's, you can go into lots of reasons. I will in the next slide talk about why we think that 1 Timothy is definitely a forgery. So this passage, 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 16, is a very close parallel in both its intent, the silencing and subordination of women, as well as its grammatical structure, the fact that it uses this verb permit it's the other case of it. So the fact that there's such a close linguistic parallelism between these two passages has caused the interpolation proponents to say that whoever interpolated it was imitating 1 Timothy. So like they were basically taking a snippet, paraphrasing, spin on 1 Timothy, and then they inserted that snippet into 1 Corinthians to have this genuine epistle of Paul say something that the forgery in his name later argued. And I'll explain why I don't think that's what happened. You can... So this passage, 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 16, has a lot of other things in it that are un-Pauline, right? It says it blames Eve rather than Adam. Historical Paul tends to blame Adam. He's the transgressor in the real Paul, right? It talks about Eve being saved through, or women being saved through childbearing, whereas the historical Paul, the genuine Paul, tends to be not super big on procreation, not big on sexual relationships, right? It's more abstinence and celibacy are favored in, say, 1 Corinthians 7. So you can see First Epistle of Timothy as largely a corrective, it imitates the structure of 1 Corinthians in many ways. It's inspired directly by 1 Corinthians, but it subtly corrects and challenges some of the more radical interpretations of 1 Corinthians. So in my view, it's actually the pastor, the author of 1 Timothy, who is imitating 1 Corinthians rather than someone else taking a piece of this letter and putting it back into that letter. All right, you can go to the next slide now if you don't mind. Oh yes, that slide I just highlighted the word verb permit, which is that word that was only found in those two passages. Next slide, please. So again, just to reiterate, why is it that 1 Timothy is strongly considered to be a forgery, even by some conservatives? It's not exclusively heretics or liberals or people or source critics who are not believing Christians who regard 1 Timothy as a forgery. The evidence for it being a forgery goes way back to early Christian times. It's not found in either of the two, either the Papyrus 46, which is the oldest, more or less complete codex of Paul's epistles. It's not found in Codex Vaticanus, which is the oldest, more or less complete Christian Bible, whole Christian Bible. So both of those codices are completely lacking. The so-called pastoral epistles, which is the group of 3 epistles that 1 Timothy is sort of the head of. It's not in Marcion's canon list, which is the oldest known canon list. So he excludes the pastoral epistles. And it's unevenly defended by early Christians, including the proto-Orthodox. So most people consider, for example, Tatian of the Gospel Harmonizer, who he believed in Paul's more radical views about celibacy and marriage, right? And so he had theological reasons to reject 1 Timothy, and later commentators say he did. So that's an example of somebody who is not normally considered to be like a Marcionite, but who also thought 1 Timothy was a forgery. And then some people argue that 2 Timothy is not a forgery, like Origen of Alexandria said, 2 Timothy, nobody can say 2 Timothy is a forgery. And that's interesting because he's not similarly defending 1 Timothy. He takes it for granted. He believes 1 Timothy is really Paul, but he's not drawing attention to it in the same way he is 2 Timothy, because 2 Timothy, it suggests that 2 Timothy had more support than 1 Timothy did, on the basis of the fact that it had more indignant, an indignant response to claims that it wasn't really Paul. And 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy don't agree with each other, suggesting that even though they're traditionally considered to be the same author, the pastor, because the pastoral epistles are all attributed to this particular pseudo-Paul named the pastor. But 2 Timothy doesn't follow the same genre as 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy is like Titus. It's like a early canon law. It's like a list of rules. Whereas 2 Timothy is a different genre. It's a farewell discourse. And 2 Timothy also talks a lot about important women leaders in the early church, where 1 Timothy doesn't seem to allow for the existence of women leaders. So just on the gender issue, you can see a discrepancy between 1 and 2 Timothy. And the early proto-Orthodox text, the Acts of Paul, engages with both of these epistles. You can see that the same names and a lot of the same themes as both of the 1 and 2 Timothy come up in the Acts of Paul. And the Acts of Paul, which again is proto-Orthodox, it occurs in one of the early canon lists of Hippolytus of Rome, Hippolytus of Rome believed it was real, genuine scripture, right? And he's considered like one of the first Catholics. So in the Acts of Paul, 2 Timothy is generally treated favorably. Like the themes and people in 2 Timothy are held up high, but the themes and features of 1 Timothy are treated unfavorably. So that suggests, again, that the author of the Acts of Paul probably viewed 2 Timothy as scripture and 1 Timothy as something more dubious than that. So the evidence for 1 Timothy being fake is kind of rock solid. And even some modern conservatives are like, yeah, okay, 1 Timothy is a little bit hard to defend. It includes church offices that didn't exist. It cites Luke as scripture, and Luke didn't write until after Paul died, right? So you can't have an epistle attributed to Paul citing the gospel according to Luke as scripture if Paul actually wrote it. All right, let's go to the next slide. So the other strong evidence that the interpolation proponents have, and I'm going to show why I disagree with this in a second. My mentor, David Odell Scott, is one of the people whose arguments I'm advancing here. He's one of those people who independently proposed the quotation-refutation reading. So there are no manuscripts lacking this passage, no manuscripts of 1 Corinthians 14 lacking this particular passage. But there is an entire manuscript tradition called the Western text type, which begins around late 2nd century probably in northern Italy, and spawns a major family of texts in the West that is pretty dominant in early Western Christianity. It eventually goes extinct in the late medieval period, but for centuries, it was one of the most influential text types. And it was in that text type, beginning probably in the late 2nd century, that this passage was displaced, that verses 34 and 35 were moved after verse 40. And what does this do? The effect of this is it renders the quotation-refutation reading impossible. Once you move the passage to here, you can no longer see Paul rendering a negative judgment against the speaker of the passage. How do we? Why do we speculate about quotation and stuff? Because again, there was no punctuation in these manuscripts. The early Greek text would have been neutral continuous script, where it depended on the reader understanding context, right? So the recipient of the letter would know what they wrote, and later readers are left to sort of try and figure it out, which is why so many discrepant interpretations are possible. So clearly the scribes who were at the base of the Western text type manuscript tradition recognized, in my view, recognized a problem with the canonical verse location, that it was ambiguous, that there was at least the possibility that Paul was giving these Corinthian men a hard time for their point of view. And so by sheltering it at the end of the chapter, it basically prevents Paul's critical judgment from landing on the speaker. And it's this that is key, because the first exegesis of this passage with Tertullian of Carthage is one that harmonizes it with with 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 15, that parallel passage. In other words, all the early commentators read those two together and paraphrase them together and interpret them as a single mandate against women's public leadership. A lot of modern English Bibles enhance this interpretation by dropping the heta, dropping the negative particle, so that some English versions you don't, and because of English's lack of gendered pronouns, you don't have any idea that Paul's talking about someone else other than the women referred to in the previous passage. And traditionalist English language speaking theologians often read it this way. All right, you can go to the next slide, please. The early Western text type editors knew that the eta particle, which is that it's an H or an E that is like translated as what or, that this particle could be used to enhance a negative reading. How do we know that the early text type manuscript tradition recognized this function of this Greek particle? Because they occasionally interpolated it elsewhere to enhance a negative reading. So here we have Romans 6, 15 and 16, where the Western editors have inserted that eta to give a more incredulous tone to Paul's response to a situation, right? So this is an indication that if they saw the heta as doing this here, that same scribal tradition would have recognized the potential undermining of the potency of that passage as a tool for subordinating women in its canonical location. So that is a motivation for this displacement. Conversely, if you're interpolating the passage, and this is another argument against original interpolation of the passage into canonical verse location, it's an inept place for an interpolator to insert it. An interpolator that chooses the canonical location is choosing the place where it can be read skeptically, right? If you're going to interpolate it, then you would expect the earlier, and by the way, the canonical verse location is most definitely earlier. It's universal outside of the Western tradition. It's represented across a lot of different manuscripts of different text types, different families. So nobody really seriously doubts that the canonical location is the original location. And if you're a misogynist interpolator, why would you pick that spot? So again, this suggests a displacement by an agenda-driven scribe who is attempting to shelter and protect what becomes the traditionalist reading of this passage as undermining women's public leadership prerogatives. You can go to the next passage and the next slide. All right, and the first interpretation of this passage that we have is from Tertullian of Carthage around the very beginning of the 3rd century. And Tertullian of Carthage reads it in what becomes the normative way. He cites it several times. He usually cites it alongside 1 Timothy. But even he recognizes that Paul allows women to speak because it says so elsewhere in the epistle. And so he's also, Tertullian is the member of a woman-led heresy. He's a Montanist, and their Montanists are led by female prophets. And so he's careful to indicate, I think, that women don't speak in church, but that women speak after church. So after church is when the female prophets of his sect are active. That's one possible way of explaining the contradiction in Tertullian's writing about this stuff. It's also possible that Tertullian softens over time, that he begins as more of a hardliner, and then as a more mature writer, he becomes more exposed to different views of this. But when he's attacking Marcion, for this passage, he's noting that Marcion is he calls Marcion a hypocrite for two reasons. One, because this passage cites the law, right? And Marcion is not supposed to cite the law. Marcion is, of course, your viewers who have watched your interviews with other scholars should know that Marcion is a very influential second century theologian who regards the Jewish scriptures as invalid. And so, and only regards Paul as a valid apostle and one gospel, in addition to the epistles of 10 epistles attributed to Paul. Marcion's retention of Old Testament or Hebrew Bible citations inside Paul is something that Tertullian is constantly pointing out as hypocritical. How can Marcion believe what he does when Paul argues against him by citing the law? So the use of the law is one reason why Tertullian regards this as Marcion being hypocritical, and also because Marcion had sisters or women evangelists that would speak in tongues during the assemblies. So this is the other reason why he cites this passage as a critique of Marcion. And later Christian theologians are more extreme than Tertullian. They take it further. Like Origen says that women shouldn't be allowed to speak outside of their homes, right? Which becomes the basis for what's almost a canon law in future centuries. So women are slowly lose their rights within Christianity as leaders over time. But there's no real indication that before this time women were forbidden from speaking in churches, which is another really interesting conundrum. This is present in all the manuscripts going back to the earliest times, yet it wasn't enforced. It wasn't like people didn't follow the teaching that women shouldn't speak. That means that something like the quotation-refutation hypothesis can explain how the verse was present, but it was ignored. And here's the key. Tertullian wasn't using the canonical verse order. He was an early Latin theologian. He was involved in that sort of transmission of Greek texts into Old Latin, and the early Old Latin manuscripts followed the Western text type. So you can explain his normative reading of the passage by the fact that he's using a Western manuscript tradition which does not follow canonical verse order. You can go to the next slide. The issue of the law is also really important and modern interpreters have had a problem here. When people try to connect this to the Hebrew Bible, it fails in a number of ways. There is no part of the Hebrew scripture that says women cannot speak in the synagogue. It doesn't occur anywhere. There's no possible source citation for a rule against women speaking inside of a synagogue. In fact, we have inscriptional evidence from this period in Judaism, the period that Paul emerges from, that women indeed were involved in the operations of synagogues. They were high-level patrons of synagogues. So they were absolutely leaders who were allowed to speak and who were women in Judaism at this time. So what law is being referred to? Jacob, your
What law is being referred to?
what law is being referred to? Remember what did I say about the Corinthian congregation? Who were they?
Um, they were people that didn't have an issue with women speaking in church, while here is the opposite is portrayed.
Well, no.
Well,
What I was going to say is the Corinthian congregation was Gentile dominated,
right. Okay.
right? So they were mostly Hellenistic God-fearers. So they were people who were favored, a monotheistic view of, the universe, who were predisposed well towards Hellenistic Judaism, but their cultural orientation was fundamentally Hellenistic. So the law in this passage, I contend, the law that is being referred to by the person who's the Corinthian misogynist that's being quoted here by Paul, is the one citing the law, and the one who is, and when he says, "What did the word of God originate with you?" He's questioning, right? He's questioning whether that's a valid interpretation of the law.
Okay.
The
So
law
basically, he's saying that they're wrong, that women can talk in church.
Right,
Okay.
because there's evidence all over the Pauline epistles that he had women who were involved in leading these movement with him, right? He was not just a dude bro with the other dude bros. There were tons of women involved in his movement, and they were not insignificant figures. These were major, important leaders, people he called apostles. So the fact that someone was saying they shouldn't be allowed to speak rubbed him the wrong way, and he says no. I mean, that's essentially the way I read it. The law here is Greco-Roman law. The law here is not Hebrew law, which doesn't say that. Now, hold on. There are some interpretations of Hebrew law that say that, like commentaries on the Hebrew Bible that say similar things, like by Philo of Alexandria and some other early Talmudic sources. But all of those are influenced by Roman law, right? In other words, they're all harmonizing the Hebrew and the Roman. That's to a T. That's what they're doing. And so this is a similar thing. Someone here is trying to ascribe a Greco-Roman idea to a Jewish source. And that is where it goes wrong. So let's go one more slide. You want to find out where this kind of idea comes from. Women were not allowed to speak in public assemblies in Greco-Roman tradition. That's the law that's being cited. It goes back likely to Aristotle or maybe earlier. Not everyone thought like Aristotle, but Aristotle is very influential in defining Hellenistic thought after, Alexander the Great spreads Greek imperialism into Jewish contexts, right? The Seleucid dynasty and then later Roman rule of Judea results in Hellenization, a steady Hellenization of the Judean world. And it's in Aristotle that women are not allowed to speak in the assembly. And they're also considered to be naturally inferior to men and subordinate to their husbands. And so it is most likely that the particular legal tradition that is being referred to here is not Jewish originally, but Gentile. And you can go on one more time. And the early Christian movement was anti-Hellenistic. And it came out of Hellenistic Judaism, but it was countercultural in many, many respects. It was opposed to a lot of the cultural norms of the Hellenistic world. And here's the key. The Western textile manuscript tradition is full of modifications that diminish women's authority. It's not just this one. That the sheltering of the key misogynistic verses at the end of the chapter, where they are not subject to Paul's critical refutation, is just one of a slew of examples of Paul being kind of changed in both the epistles and in the Acts of the Apostles, which is, the canonical biography and sort of like story of Paul's missions, right? So, and this generally involves subtle tweaks where the status of particular women is diminished relative to the men in their company. It can involve occasional verse displacements, just like we've seen here. So, what will be an example of another displacement in Romans 16, verses 3 through 5. Verse 5a is moved before verse 4. Why? Because originally, in the canonical verse order, Paul thanks his close associate Priscilla, who is usually mentioned before her husband, Aquila, that she is mentioned by Paul and praised for saving him, for saving his neck, by risking her own neck to save his life. By displacing that passage to before verse 4, it makes Paul now praise the entire congregation. So he doesn't single out a woman for praise, right? This is an example. There are occasionally women who are dropped completely, like Damaris in the font on my screen is small, so I'm not going to try and cite all these. But this chart is in the article, so you can access it and look at it in the open access article. There is one additional example that I found after publication. So that's the one in 1 Corinthians 16:19, where it's often the case that Priscilla's name is moved after her husband. Right? Priscilla's name 9 times out of 10 occurs in the original manuscripts before the husband, indicating her status is more important. She was a more important leader than her husband was. In Paul's view, his esteem was to always mention her first, but you see that switched a lot in the Western text type tradition. In other cases, you have women who are mentioned as an independent group of apostles who are then called wives of apostles, right? In other words, their status is always in the Western tradition configured in relation to their male superiors. Was there one other example I wanted to mention quickly? Oh, yes. The change of women to men. Sometimes women get turned into men in the epistles. So Nympha was one of the common ones. Some people still debate, was she a woman or was she a man? It's likely she was a woman, but that her name was masculinized because she was the proprietor of a house church, according to Colossians. A lot of these patrons, the financial backers of early Christianity or Paul's time, were the wealthy widows who converted and allowed their homes, their villas, to be used for worship, for Christian worship. So that meant that in practice, women often owned and operated churches in Paul's day, and that is reflected in the canonical text, but it is downplayed in these particular revisions that we see in the Western text type. Okay, so I think I've covered most of what I wanted to cover here. Again, just to reiterate, a final takeaway, that we know that, for example, Marcion included this passage in his edition in his version of the first epistle to the Corinthians. He included this passage. And he also allowed women to speak in tongues during church. And he included it despite the fact that it refers to the law, or it cites the law as the basis for this argument, for the argument that women shouldn't speak. This indicates that Marcion must have had a reading that we don't possess. He must have had the exegesis in the second century must have been different than the exegesis that became normative after the third century. And the normative exegesis is entirely rooted in this corrupted Western text type that has eventually fallen out of favor. So again, late medieval, early modern period, the canonical verse order again dominates. But this is after a long period when these Western norms in church governance have been spreading out throughout the entire Christian world. So it's in the medieval period that you see the influence of the Western interpretation appearing first in the Byzantine world. So where are the last manuscripts with this altered form of the verse? The last manuscripts are not Western, but they're actually later Eastern ones, like minuscule 88. Indicating again that this sort of women's subordination trend expanding out of its original source in the West and becoming influential elsewhere. But we know for a fact that women were important leaders in the early church, also from archaeological evidence. As we excavate more and more early Christian sites where there are mosaics, they indicate women were leaders in these churches. We find prominent women's graves in graveyards, sometimes buried with Eucharistic paraphernalia, indicating that these were people with liturgical authority. We see mosaics that show women wearing clerical vestments, including things that are only reserved for high-ranking bishops and such. So all indication is that the early Christianity that was free of women's leadership is a kind of a myth that built up over time and now we kind of project our modern idea back onto the ancient past. But this was a religion that was popular among women and slaves, and the earliest Christian communities included, in many cases, majority women, as indicated by seizures of church property, which shows how many women's clothes were, like during the persecutions of the late 3rd century. There were seizures of church property in North Africa that showed that mostly women's garments were held in the churches. And this particular epistle, 1 Corinthians, was incredibly popular among women, right? It was popular among the whole congregation. And prior to Tertullian, people cite 1 Corinthians as endorsing women's speech in church. Like I think it's Irenaeus, who says literally when he's arguing against some heresy or another, he says that he's arguing against some heresy that sees certain people as being superior, like a kind of a Gnostic kind of thing. I forget precisely the heretics he was arguing against. Certain people are superior and others are inferior. And he said, no, the Apostle Paul says men and women are allowed to prophesy in church. He literally, Irenaeus cites this epistle arguing the opposite of the way it's conventionally read. So that either means that he was reading a version that lacked this passage, like the interpolation view, or one, again, where the conventional reading was different than the one that becomes normal. All right. So, Jacob, do you have any questions or comments?
Do you think it's possible that the author of 1 Timothy that includes that verse that is similar to what is believed to be an interpolation in 1 Corinthians is the person that inserted it into 1 Corinthians?
So again, I don't think it's an interpolation. I'm arguing against the interpolation view.
Okay.
I think that it's Paul's quotation of his Corinthian opponent. But I think that whoever wrote, because the manuscript evidence for 1 Corinthians is much stronger. 1 Timothy is an imitation of 1 Corinthians. It's like a knockoff of 1 Corinthians. What do I mean by this? It shows very little evidence of influence by any of Paul's other writings. So we tend to think of like the collection of Paul as circulating as a collection. But the reality is that the earliest timeframes, these were individual letters, right? They wouldn't be like, in other words, if you knew one or two of Paul's letters or three or four, you wouldn't know them all as one anthology, right? But you might encounter them in different times and places. So while early church authorities cite Paul extensively, virtually none of them cite Paul comprehensively. They tend to cite Paul in a kind of a piecemeal way. Well, 1 Corinthians is one of the most cited sources, indicating that it of all of Paul's works, 1 Corinthians was probably the most popular, the most widely read, the most accessible, the one that was like the most. So whoever the pastor who wrote 1 Timothy is probably heavily influenced by just that one epistle, and not by, it's a forger's tell. Like if you're imitating a Rembrandt painting, you're like trying to copy it, and you have one painting of Rembrandt that's the basis for your fake, and you're inserting your own ideas, but you're using kind of like the style of Rembrandt to make your painting look like Rembrandt. It's going to be easy to tell that you're only using one source to imitate, right? And that real Rembrandt doesn't have to imitate himself. Real Rembrandt is original. Real Rembrandt can come up with new stuff anytime Rembrandt's actually painting. Paul's the same way. The genuine epistles of Paul stand out as being authentic because they're kind of chaotic and original. They don't have to like mechanically imitate other sources. Whereas the epistles that are generally regarded as forgeries tend to be dependent on real Paul in order to make their form look like Paul. And so you see, in particularly, 1 Timothy looks to me and to to the people who I respect on this argument as being a kind of a commentary, a riff on 1 Corinthians 7 primarily, which is the basis for a lot of the monastic and celibacy and anti-alcohol stuff that's at the basis of radical Paulinism, right? So early radical Paulinists were really into 1 Corinthians chapter 7 as the basis for sort of lifestyle rules. And you can see 1 Timothy as critiquing them, saying, oh, you're getting Paul wrong. Here's what Paul really meant, right? And so it's like a self-correction. And it's one that's really laser focused on the controversies of the 2nd century church that were based on interpretations of this really popular epistle. And so I think that although that was the main focus, I think the pastor threw in this riff on 1 Corinthians 14, again, because the passage is ambiguous. It can be read in two different ways. And so what's the opinion of the author of 1 Timothy? Is a gender traditionalist, right? He's pushing a gender traditionalist, like a straight up Greco-Roman gender rules. And he's reading what I see as the Corinthian opponents, but he's reading that in the voice of Paul, which is easy to do because Paul is really complicated. Paul is really, the reply structure of the text, where you can't tell exactly where one voice begins and the other voice ends, right? It becomes a matter of subjective interpretation. And so a lot of this would have come from the way the culture's reading it, like tone and inflection. In fact, even in English, if you read the same passage in English using different tones, different voice, right, you can make the quotation refutation hypothesis seem obvious, or you can make it seem the other way just by changing the way your voice works, right? Not altering the words of the passage at all. So yeah, I think that the forger, the pastoral forger, or the pastor who wrote 1 Timothy, is key to understanding how the normal reading of this passage is established. The later Western editors that rearranged the passage facilitated it further. But at this time, probably in this mid-2nd century, when 1 Timothy is being written, we're dealing with like the base of that split in interpretation over this really difficult passage.
Do you think that there are real interpolations into the authentic letters?
Yeah, I do, but they're hard to prove. The ones that are real or the most likely real are the ones that are unambiguously absent. I can't think of any right off the top of my head, but most of them are relatively controversial, or they're debated, right? Because they might not have manuscript evidence to support them, but they're based, like anyone can argue that anything is an interpolation based on context. And sometimes people are motivated to say something is an interpolation because it disagrees with my view of what Paul should say. right? Like the anti-Judaic passages in First Thessalonians come to mind, where people who don't want Paul to have any anti-Judaism, right, or any explicit like blaming Jews for the crucifixion, they want that to be an interpolation. And I'm sort of sympathetic with that argument, but I have to admit that it's because of my own views on the subject, right? It's my own biases make me sympathetic to that interpretation view. But there's no surviving documentary evidence that strongly supports it. So it will always be a hypothetical. And that's true for a lot of the arguments for interpolation in genuine Paul.
Let's say that Paul did write 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16, and it says that the wrath of God came upon Judea because of what they had done to Jesus.
Right.
If that really was in there from day one, could that suggest he could have written it as late as 70?
So we're getting into a series of hypotheticals here. As you might have been in part of the group chat we were in the other day, where someone was addressed, it might have been Dave or somebody who's Dave Allen, who was addressing arguments surrounding this. There were other conflicts and other retributions. So in other words, the wrath of Rome was felt in Judea on more than one occasion leading up to 70. So considering it's kind of a vague allusion and not a direct, explicit discussion of a particular event, then it becomes kind of speculative. And I historically, I think that if it refers to events post 70, then it can't possibly be Paul, right? Because Paul doesn't write it. Paul, as a rule, this is one of his earliest letters, right? Most people think First Thessalonians is like the earliest letter, if not one of the earliest letters that he wrote. So how could it have? I mean, I know if you're interested in pushing the dating of all the letters past 70, then that's your starting point. I suppose that would be the beginning of your argument. But then why don't any of the other letters, genuine epistles of Paul, why don't any of them have any allusion to the events of that decade, which resulted in such permanent transformation? Everything suggests, in my opinion, that Paul is writing in a period before Judaism and Christianity are fully differentiated, and before before they're forced to go their separate ways by circumstances and events which cause their communities to. I mean, Judaism and Christianity didn't fully differentiate until after the Nicene period. Really, it wasn't until there were rules enforced about not fraternizing, not going to synagogues, and hanging out with Jews. But prior to those rules being enforced, it was fuzzy. The difference between Judaism and Christianity was still fuzzy. But in Paul's time, they were super fuzzy, right? He was a weird Jew. He was a Jew who was not normative, who was preaching things that were contrary to normal, respectable Jewish customs, for sure. But it doesn't mean he wasn't a Jew. And so, yeah, it's possible that he was critiquing certain Jews in that passage. I'm not, but again, this is not what my work is about. I will leave that to other specialists to debate whether Paul. But that was just an example of another interpolation scenario, possible interpolation scenario, on the basis of your question.
When do you think that these pastoral letters were most likely written?
Again, so while most people regard 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus as all being the same author, I'm not sure that they weren't, but I'm pretty sure that 2 Timothy is not the same as the other two. 1 Timothy and Titus have more in common. I'm sort of leaning towards the fact that I think 1 Timothy was the last of the three. I think that Titus and 2 Timothy existed, and maybe like a little tiny pastoral codex, and it gets expanded in stages. This is possible with 2 Timothy. So I mentioned that 1 Timothy has a lot of evidence of being influenced by 1 Corinthians. Like 1 Corinthians is like the direct inspiration for 1 Timothy, but it also has a kind of a synoptic affinity with 2 Timothy and with Titus, right? Which is why they're grouped together and seen as like the same author. But Second Timothy is a better forgery if Second Timothy is a forgery, and I think it probably is. It's a better forgery. It looks more like real Paul for a number of reasons. It's got a more organic, holistic similarity to Paul's writing as a whole. It's not quite as amateurish in its efforts. It doesn't lack. It lacks the obvious references to second century church offices, right? It doesn't quote Luke. You know what I mean? It doesn't make those kind of mistakes. So if it's a fake, it's a fake that's more effective. And so I think it's earlier. I think it's, and again, the precise dating of these texts is not key to my argument.
So basically,
I'm flexible with different dating scenarios, but definitely I'm with First Timothy in particular. I think it's probably influenced by Titus and Second Timothy heavily, which is why it has so many like genre type affinities with both of them. It's a lot like both of them. So I think that it must have been written after they were written. And I think that it could be the latest of all of them, just on the fact that it's written at a time when Luke is not only exists, but Luke is regarded as scripture by the community, right? Which means it's probably post Marcion, right? Because Marcion didn't call it Luke, but the core of Marcion's gospel is a primitive version of Luke. So if it seems to me that First Timothy is an anti-Marcionite, proto-Orthodox anti-Marcionite text.
Hence its uses of gnosis in the text.
Right. And so whoever the author of First Timothy, and who might be very late, again, it's because First Timothy is not defended by Tatian. He only defends Titus, right? There are or the Acts of Paul clearly regards First Timothy with skepticism. So the indication to me is that it's probably, in my humble opinion, First Timothy is the single strongest case for a canonical forgery in the entire New Testament. I think every other example of proposed pseudepigrapha, of proposed fakes in the canon. And by the way, I'm not being skeptical towards those other claims. I think that there's probably lots of forged documents, but I think that the case for First Timothy being a forgery is pretty much ironclad, whereas you can split hairs on virtually every other one. But I just don't see any way around, saying this wasn't written by Paul. And when it was written, it would have to be written after the sources that it depends on and it derives from were not only existent, but also in circulation. They didn't just exist somewhere, but they existed. There were enough copies floating around that you could be sure that this author was exposed to them and had them at his disposal.
So if that's the case, basically, First Timothy should be renamed Second Timothy, and Second Timothy is really First Timothy.
Yeah, and those names and numbers are just based on the tradition of how they're arranged, right? It's like you can say the same thing about some other cases. It's like it's possible if Second Corinthians is a composite text, as some people believe, it's like it's authentic Paul, but it's like made of pieces of other letters. Then it's possible that, and we know that Paul's letters are incomplete, that there's some missing ones, right? That there's probably a third letter to the Corinthians that's not, and maybe a negative one, maybe a prequel letter. We don't know exactly how many letters to the Corinthians there were, and it's possible that some of those lost letters are put into Second Corinthians, and it's just called Second Corinthians because it's like the scraps that were left over and cobbled together, because there's different themes. You know what I mean? It doesn't have like the coherence that First Corinthians has, and where it's like a complete and total package. So if that's the case, then what parts of Second Corinthians might be older than First Corinthians? We don't know. So the numbering of the epistles doesn't say that much about the order that they were written. It really just says about the order that they're arranged. First and Second Thessalonians, among people who believe Second Thessalonians is real Paul, and that's another disputed one. But among those scholars who believe that they're both written by Paul, I think they would also say the same thing about the order that they were written not being clear. That it's possible that they were written in the reverse order to the way that they are labeled.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to our next visit.
Same here. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.